With this, we start our macroeconomics. Now, what is macroeconomics? We've talked about macroeconomics in an earlier discussion. Macroeconomics deals with the relationship between economic variables at the aggregate level. That is, when you're looking at the economy as a whole. Now, in building a theory to explain those relationships, what we look at as a starting point is our aggregate demand and aggregate supply theory. So let's start with aggregate demand of an economy or the total demand of an economy. Aggregate demand represents the total amount of effective demand in an economy. In other words, it is all the various demands come together, which means that not only it represents the consumers, it represents also the demand by firms, by government, or even by foreigners for our goods and services. So we look at aggregate demand as the total demand of an economy. So when you look at aggregate demand closely, our aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M, where C is basically consumption by households. I stands for investment by firms. So this is the expenditure by firms. This expenditure is basically on capital goods, which we have identified as very important for economic growth in the future. G, on the other hand, is what we call our government expenditure. And X minus M is our net exports, which basically means exports minus imports. Now, when you look at net exports, X minus M, exports are basically demand of our goods by foreigners, and therefore that is our total demand for the goods and services of an economy. But why am I subtracting imports, which is basically the demand of foreign goods by our individuals? Because that is the demand, or that is the goods and services which are not made in the economy. Because right now we're figuring the demand for all the goods and services that are made in the economy, and that's why I'm subtracting imports, because although people have done consumption on goods, but I need to subtract all the foreign consumption from it to find out the local consumption. So all of this, when I subtract imports, will contain what we call domestic demand for goods and services. So let's look at consumption very closely. If you look at consumption as a component, it is the consumption done by households on goods and services. Now, this is probably one of the more important factors when it comes to the total output or GDP of an economy, because consumption makes up roughly 50% of any economy's total demand. And one could argue that this consumption is influenced by the level of real income in an economy, like how much income that an economy earns after taking into account inflation. And higher the income, when the income go up, higher will be this consumption, because people will have more money to spend on goods and services. We will talk about the difference between a real income versus nominal income again in a little while, because when we draw the graph, we'll distinguish between real income and nominal income. But just to make it very clear, real income, as we discussed earlier in a micro chapter, depends on what we call our purchasing power. So when your purchasing power goes up, you will have more money to buy goods and services, and therefore consumption will go up. The second component we'd like to focus on is investment. When we look at investment is basically spending by firms, in particularly on investment goods or capital goods. Now, why is investment in capital goods important? We talked about this in the PPC chapter, that whenever the firms are investing, it is good because it will result in higher production level in the future. So you will see economic growth to take place, because investment is basically going to lead to higher production of goods and services in the future. And as a economy, it is a very important component when it comes to expenditure, because it is going to guarantee future economic growth for any economy.
Quick pause. If you're finding value in this explanation, there's so much more to discover. At Alt Academy, we break down every A-level concept with the same level of clarity. Now, let's continue.
The third factor we focus on is government spending. Now, what is government spending? Well, government is also spending money. We know this. Government spends a lot of money on various things. For example, the government may spend on public goods, on sometimes merit goods. Also, sometimes it is spending money in order to allow it to carry its own, for example, operations, because you might have a government organization or bureaucracy that requires money to, of course, operate. Also, the government is spending money in terms of making sure that they are protecting the vulnerable people in the society, or they are basically developing roads and infrastructure, all of which is really important for any economy to grow. Lastly, we talk about something called net exports. When you look at net exports, well, net exports is basically contains of it has what we call two things. One is all the domestic residents and firms are spending on imported goods, which is goods and services that are coming into the country. Now we subtract that from our equation. Why? Because this is that demand which is not of domestic goods but of foreign goods. But we also add at the same time foreign consumers, uh, and firms are purchasing goods and services in the domestic economy, and that is basically our goods and services that are using our resources. So that's why we add that to our equation. So while exports can make the AD curve shift uh, upward or increase the aggregate demand, as we'll talk about later, imports will decrease your aggregate demand, because if a country is buying a lot of foreign goods, then they are not buying domestic goods, and that can result in the aggregate demand of the economy to go down. Let's draw the aggregate demand for the economy. When we look at aggregate demand of the economy, we're looking at the relationship between price level and the total output, or real GDP. Now, I want to talk about real GDP a little bit more. What is real versus nominal GDP? Well, nominal GDP is GDP that is not taking into account the price level. But when you come to real GDP is something that takes into account the price level. So, for example, let's say if an economy is making 100 units and the price of each unit is, for example, $2. Now, this would mean if you look at the total value or of this output, or total GDP, gross domestic product of this country, the total output or gross domestic product, gross means total, just to explain that also. Domestic means within the economy, and P means product, so within the economy. So you're looking at total output. So if you look at an economy where quantity is 100 and price is $2, the total value of this output would be, for example, $200. Right? Now, what do we mean by real? Real means after taking into account the price changes. So for example, next year prices go to, let's say, $4, but the quantity is still, let's say, 100. Now, although the value of the GDP is 400, but because the quantity did not change, we can't say that your output is actually doubling in this case. Only the prices are doubling. So real GDP, which takes into account this change in price, will actually say we need to ignore the changes in prices but only consider changes in output. And because the output has not changed from 100, it has remained 100, we'll say the total GDP has remained the same. Now, when I draw my graph on my y-axis, I'm going to consider my price level, and I'll talk about price level in 1 minute. I have price level here, and I have on my x-axis real GDP of the economy. Now, we did talk about real GDP, but what is price level? Price level is the average prices of the whole economy, because we are now looking at not one good but many goods. In fact, all the goods of the economy. We can't consider price of one good, we need to consider the price of the whole economy, so the whole price level. And when you look at price level, it is an indication of the cost of living of an economy. So if I look at my aggregate demand curve, I will find my aggregate demand curve to be something like this: a downward sloping demand curve, where it is made up of C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Now, I am saying this, that AD curve is downward sloping, and the reason why it is, we'll talk about this in 1 minute, but it basically means that if your price level is going, for example, down from P naught to P1. If the price level goes down, your real GDP or the total output that you make in an economy actually goes up. So a lower price level leads to a higher GDP of an economy. So let's talk about why it happens. But there is what we call a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, which simply means that when the overall price level is relatively low, aggregate demand will be relatively high, and when the price level is relatively high, aggregate demand will be relatively low.
If you found that helpful, imagine what you could achieve with the full economics course. Over 60,000 students have used Alt Academy to transform their A-levels journey. Don't wait and take the first step today.